Good evening and welcome to the Discovery Museum Speaker Series. Tonight, we're featuring Dr. Ellen Winter, who's going to be speaking with us about the psychology of artistic behavior in children. I'm Neil Gordon, and I'm the CEO here at the Discovery Museum. And before we get started tonight, I just want to cover a little housekeeping details about Zoom webinar. Webinar is being recorded and will be available after tonight on our website, discoveryacton.org. If during the webinar you have any questions for the moderators of tonight, please use the chat function. But for those of you who are going to have questions for our Dr. Winter, please use the Q&A button, and we will be using your many questions following the presentation for our Q&A time. So as we start, please indulge me as I spend a couple of minutes thanking the organizations whose sponsorship of tonight have allowed us to present the speaker series free of charge. I'll then say a couple of words about the Discovery Museum, and then we'll begin with Dr. Winter's presentation. So first, let me acknowledge our lead sponsors. The Foundation of Metro West was established in 1995, and it's the only community foundation serving our region. It promotes philanthropy across the area, helps donors maximize the impact of their local giving, and serves as a resource for local nonprofit organizations like the Discovery Museum, and enhances the quality of life for us all. We really appreciate the Foundation's support of this year's speaker series. Enterprise Bank is headquartered in Lowell, Massachusetts, with 24 branch locations throughout the Merrimack Valley and the north central regions of Massachusetts, southern New Hampshire. They are a true community bank, leading with a deep sense of mission and purpose. Their success is consistently measured by the success of the individuals, businesses, and communities they enthusiastically serve. Enterprise Bank is proud to support the Discovery Museum and our speaker series. Acton Medical Associates is celebrating their 65th birthday this year. They're an independently owned and operated primary care practice for adults and pediatrics in Acton, Harvard, Littleton, and with a fourth location opening soon in Hudson. Acton Medical is committed to the good health and wellness of the community and sponsors over 130 local causes every year, including the Discovery Museum. We're truly thankful for their support in our speaker series. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the Discovery Museum. The Discovery Museum is now 38 years old, and we started with a really strong sense of being there to promote science, nature, and play for all children. In 2019, we served over 240,000 young people and their families. That included children in 1,900 classrooms, 38,000 kids from over 100 communities throughout Eastern Massachusetts. Importantly, the Discovery Museum really believes that our services should be available to everyone, and we've tried to make economics not a barrier by serving over 25% of the folks we serve for free or all nearly for free. The work we do is based on some really basic ideas. We believe that it's important to start early and recognize the importance of parents as the first teachers of their children. Luckily for us, all the kids who come to the museum come with their parents, and we're able to have quite an impact on parents as well as children. We believe that creativity and curiosity are the tools that children use to discover the world around them, and we support and foster the natural creativity and curiosity that every child comes with. I'm sure Dr. Winter is going to talk a little bit about creativity tonight. It's important for kids to have a connection with the world outside, and we believe and are able to get kids outdoors when they come to visit the museum. And like I said, we believe we should be there for every child and every family. Please take seriously our thought that right now, more than ever, play matters for children. The Discovery Museum has been open after being closed in March since late July. And in response to that, we've adopted very strict protocols for visiting both indoors and outdoors. We're operating at a very limited capacity, around 20%, which is lower than is allowed under the state guidelines. Luckily for us, kids love coming back, even with masks on, even socially distanced. As they said, it felt cool to be back at the Discovery Museum. When we reopened the museum, we spent an entire month being available to everyone for free. We thought that was an important way to recognize all the challenges that our community has been under. So this is not the last speaker series event for this year. We have one more important event coming up on November 12th with Dr. Jill Walsh, who will be speaking to us about managing kids' screen time during the pandemic. For more information about our speaker series, it's all available on our accessible website at discoveryacton.org. Like many organizations, our museum has had a challenging year, one which we know is just the beginning of a long process to get back to full operations. And beyond that, to be a place where once again, we are in a position to try new things and expand the impact of the museums. So my sincere thanks go out to all of you who have made a contribution when reserving your spot for tonight's presentation. Please know that your donations, connections, introductions, and advocacy make a real difference to this organization. Now it's my honor to introduce our speaker for tonight. Ellen Winter is a professor of psychology at Boston College and senior research associate at Project Zero, which is at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She directs the Arts and Mind Lab, which focuses on cognition in the arts in typical and gifted children, as well as adults. She's written over 200 articles and is the author of 4 books and the co-author of an additional 3 books. She served as president of the APA Division 10 Psychology and Arts in 1995 to 96 and received the Rudolf Arnheim Award for Outstanding Research by a senior scholar in psychology and the arts from Division 10 in 2000. She's a fellow of the APA Division 10 and of the International Association of Empirical Aesthetics. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ellen Winter. Ellen, it's great to have you with us tonight. Let's unmute Ellen.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. I said thank you so much, Neil, and hello to everybody. I wish I could see you, but alas, I cannot. I just have to believe you're out there. I am going to share my screen now. And as Neil mentioned, I might say something about creativity. Actually, the title of my talk is Creativity in Child Art, How to Nurture It and How to Kill It. I've been thinking about this because I've been writing a book. I've been working on a book about the history of art education, visual arts education in the United States. And I've discovered there are some ways that people have figured out to kill creativity as well as to foster it. So I'll be talking a bit about that. My talk has 3 sections. I'm going to start out by asking, what is special about development in child art? Then, does it matter how we teach the arts? Those are the 2 main parts of my talk. And at the very end, I'm going to say something about whether art making improves children's well-being, because I think that's an apt thing to think about right now when kids are cooped up inside. So first of all, what is special about development in art? So on the top left, you see a typical developmental trend line. Most things that developmental psychologists study get better with age. Grammar, attention, memory, politeness. Of course, that declines in adolescence. In the graph on the bottom, you see a U-shaped curve. And this is very unusual in psychology, in developmental psychology. Most things do not start out high and then get worse with age and then go back up. But actually, we have found this kind of a curve to be what best depicts behavior in the visual arts, as well as behavior in metaphorical language. And I'll talk a bit about what the evidence for this is next. But I just want to point out that the dotted line is where most of us end up. We start out high in playfulness, creativity, spontaneity, and there's a decline during middle childhood. And most people, and we call that decline the literal stage, when children get very literal minded and conventional. And then the curve rises again, but only for those who are going to go on to become artists. Most people never get out of the literal stage. Now, why do I say that early art, very young children's art, starts out high in creativity? Well, first I would like to show you the similarity, the superficial similarity at least, between preschoolers' art and abstract expressionist art. Of course, this is a Western modern art phenomenon. But on the left, you have a painting by a 4-year-old, and on the right, you have a painting by the very great and famous artist, Hans Hofmann. And I think you can see why I've paired them together. And you see this also with representational art, not just abstract art. The two on the left are by Miro, and the two on the right are by a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old child. And I think that you can see a similarity there. And what we find is that if you track children's spontaneous drawings and paintings, the wonderful exploratory, expressive paintings you see in preschools start to disappear. And by the time children are 9, 10, 11, 12, you get very conventionalized drawings where children are striving for either for realism or they're using graphic conventions. I would say this is not a realistic flower, but it is a graphic convention of how to do a flower, and it's not particularly inventive. That is what I would call a literal stage, middle childhood drawing. Now, Franz Cizek, who was the founder of the child art movement in Europe, talked about this too with other terms. He said, well, before I read what he said, I'd just like you to notice the drawing by the 5-year-old, which I think is playful and exploratory and inventive, and then the much more stilted literal drawing by the 11-year-old of the boat. And Cizek said the crisis in a child's life usually comes about 14. A child often becomes so critical of his own work that he's completely paralyzed and unable to continue creative work. After that, you have either the art of the adult or no more creative epic at all. And I think what he means by that is either the child will then go on to become an artist and the curve will go up, or you don't have any creativity at all, which is most people, non-artists. You see this kind of a U-shaped curve even in the trajectory of artists. So this is a drawing by Paul Klee at age 5. And this is a drawing by Paul Klee at age 12. And I would say that the 5-year-old drawing is playful and inventive and charming. And the one at age 12 is highly realistic, very skilled, but a lot less fun to look at. And interestingly, the 5-year-old drawing is much more like Klee's adult drawing. Here's a work by Klee as an adult. And I think if you had to put the two together that want most together, it would be the 5-year-old and the adult, but not the literal stage. You could call that a U-shaped curve. There is a decline in something. Of course, there's a gain in technical mastery, but there is a decline in something else. And there's my U-shaped curve. And here's another comparison. This is Clay at 5, called A Man, a Chair, and a Rabbit. And Clay is an adult, a devil waiting near the gate. Here's Clay at 5, an angel and an adult, which looks also like an angel. Now, Jessica Davis, who was at Project Zero, did a systematic test of the U-curve hypothesis in art. She didn't want to just rely on anecdotal examples. She wanted to really find out if she could document such a curve. So she took children of different ages and she asked them to make 3 drawings. And all she said was draw happy, draw angry, and draw sad, one at a time. And then independent judges scored the drawings on overall expression as a function of line and composition. And the children in her study were 5 years of age, 8, and 11. Then there were 2 groups of adolescents, 14-year-olds who did not identify as artists and 14-year-olds who did identify as artists. And then 2 groups of adults, those who identified as non-artists and those who identified as artists. And here's what she found. The blue line is the average score. So remember, this is for overall expression. 5-year-olds are above average. The 8-year-olds are starting to decline. The 11-year-olds are like the 8-year-olds. The 14-year-old non-artists are the same as the 8 and the 11s, not much progression. The adult non-artists, no difference. The 14-year-olds who identify as artists, they're up there with the 5-year-olds, and the adult artists are even higher. And so there you have a little U. I don't know if you can see I don't think you can see my mouse, but I was trying to show you with my mouse. So here are some examples of the drawings she found for angry. The top left, a 5-year-old who is perfectly able to draw representationally, as we could see from his other drawings. And he drew this abstract depiction of angry. And he said, when I think of angry, all I can think of is dark, dark scribbles all over the paper. Then you have to the right, a 14-year-old non-artist. He made a picture of somebody throwing a pillow at him after an argument. In other words, he depicted something that would make him angry. And on the right top, you have a 14-year-old artist, and he's depicting something that feels angry, expresses anger. And on the bottom, you have the adult non-artist, again, something that would make him angry. And the adult artist, which is very much like the 5-year-old. So there seems to be something going on here. One of the things we wondered about is this a loss, or are older children simply unwilling to draw in the playful way that 4- and 5-year-olds spontaneously draw in? So we did a little experiment. We asked children to make a drawing of something, whatever they wanted. And then we showed them some drawings by preschoolers. And the children, I neglected to say that the children who made the drawings were literal stage drawings. They were 10 and 11-year-old kids. And so one of them made this car. Then we said, can we make this child be more playful and inventive? And so we showed them drawings by preschoolers and we said, can you draw the car again, but in the style of these drawings over here? And we got something like this. And here's one other example. This child drew something that he was actually looking at in our lab, which was a table with a radiator behind it and a window with some flowers. And after he tried to draw it like the preschoolers, we didn't tell them they were preschoolers' drawings. He gave us this. And so what you find, I think you can ask yourself, do you think that the kids on the right regained the freshness of the 4- and 5-year-olds' drawings? Because I don't. We had these scored, and what we found is that the scoring showed that the the drawings they made after they'd seen the preschool art were deliberately messy, and they were less realistic, but they didn't capture what was so charming about 4 and 5-year-olds' drawings. Here they are again, and what you see is they're drawing less realistically. There's, in the window one, there's more distortion of the window, and the picture kind of loses its unity. And one child said, "I'm making this messy on purpose. I know how to draw right, but I'm doing this to make it look like the others." And so we thought, well, it's not so easy in this one-shot intervention to get kids to go back to where they were when they were preschoolers. So maybe it's a real loss. We asked various groups of judges for their preferences. We asked 4 to 5-year-olds, 9 to 10-year-olds, and college art students. And all the groups preferred the original drawings. The ones after the preschoolers' drawings had been looked at were not an improvement. So those were the ones that were preferred. We find the same kind of U-shaped curve with language, not with grammar, but with metaphor. And this was actually the first thing that I began to study when I was in graduate school, was how we could distinguish children's metaphors from mistakes. And I developed a way of distinguishing their deliberate renamings, which is what I called a metaphor, from their overextensions, where they simply might call all round things a ball, because that's a mistake, that's an overextension. And we found that we could distinguish between the metaphors and the mistakes by demonstrating in a corpus of a child's language that the child had already used, had already named an object literally. And later, when the child renamed the object, it clearly was not because he didn't know the name. And here are some examples. One child called freckles cornflakes on a person's face. Another called skywriting, a scar on the sky. Another very simple one is a child saw a red balloon on a green string, and he said, "That's the apple on the tree." And then this picture of scissors prompted one child to say, "It looks like mustaches." So these are very playful uses of language, and they're actually metaphors just like adult metaphors, because they take one thing and they rename it as something else on the basis of similarity, either in the way it looks or the way it functions. And what we found is that as children got older, they didn't like to use language this way. They said, "That's not, I like to use words correctly. This is not right." So there was a resistance to playing with language, just like we find a resistance to playing with color and line in early art. So now the bulk of my talk is going to be about whether it matters how we teach the arts. And I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm working on a book documenting the history of art education in American schools, starting with the colonial period, as I mentioned. And so let's get into that part. So in the colonial period in the United States, there was a lot of antagonism towards the arts. The Puritans didn't much like the arts. They were thought of as corrupt, extravagant. These are things that the rich people do. They're sinful, they're wasteful, they're luxurious. And in addition to that, they're useless. One American visitor went to France and visited the French court of Versailles, the palace where the French kings lived. And his comment was, "What taste, what art, what luxury, what extravagance, what sin." And I think that pretty much sums up the Puritan disdain for the arts. Now, in the 19th century in America and in Europe, art education acquired a purpose. And that's because the Industrial Revolution was going on, and it needed people who could draw. So all of a sudden, art became looked on more favorably. Not the way we look on it, but it still, it acquired a purpose, and it was therefore a good thing. Because factories needed people who could draw tools, who could design textiles, who could copy complicated things like balustrades that I've shown in the lower left, so that the people who were making these things would know how to make them. They were like blueprints for making all kinds of things that machines made. And also, they also drew machines to design machines that people, so that people could make them. And it was actually a milestone in 1870 in New England when drawing was mandated in public schools. And New England was the first place to do this in America. All kids had to study drawing. But the way they study drawing is completely different from the way we would teach it today. This is a Bartholomew's National System of Industrial Drawing. It was a book, and there are many books like this that told teachers exactly how to teach children to draw. Children were told exactly how to sit, how to hold a pencil, the order in which to copy lines, because everything was by copying. And they would have a design in their copybook on the left side, and then on the right side of the copybook, there would be a blank page for them to copy it. And in addition, the teacher would draw the image that they were to copy on the blackboard. It was pretty fail-safe. It was fail-safe because it started out step by step, so simple. Here's a quote from the Bartholomew book. "The eye should first be trained to see, the mind to perceive, and the hand to draw lines of any given length in any required position and bearing any given relation to each other. This is the first step. And until this is accomplished, it is unwise to take the next one. It can only result in failure." So this was a system that was supposed to be so simple that children wouldn't fail. Line by line copying, teacher proof. So children were taught to make a straight line by first making a dot for the beginning and the end, and then connecting the dots. And they would copy designs like this with straight lines, only straight lines in the beginning. Later on, they moved to curved lines. They wouldn't just copy this whole thing holistically. They'd be told which line to make first, which line to make next, etc. Finally, they would graduate to drawings of objects, useful objects like this. Walter Smith was the director of art education and the supervisor of drawing in Massachusetts. And he said, in the schoolroom, the danger is strenuously to be guarded against of allowing drawing to be practiced for the mere purpose of producing pretty things. Drawing was only important because it was useful. Now, I spent some time in China in 1987 studying art education methods there. And we went over to China because we wanted to figure out how it could be that Chinese children could draw so well. They were so skilled in drawing, and we thought, how is it? Are they just more talented than American children? Or is it there's something about their education system? And what we discovered is that Chinese children were taught to draw pretty much like the 19th century Massachusetts kids were taught to draw, except they weren't drawing straight lines and curved lines and goblets and things that could be used in the Industrial Revolution, but what they were drawing was the kind of schemas that you find in Chinese traditional painting. So here's an example of a goldfish. Children were taught to draw a goldfish by what's on the blackboard is a series of lines that the teacher had drawn, and each time the teacher drew a line, the child drew the same line, and you can see arrows that show the direction in which the lines are supposed to be made. And you also see on the lower left an example of a brushstroke that the teacher showed. And on the upper left, you see the finished product that all children were able to produce by this step-by-step method. If any of you have ever seen the Ed Emberley How to Draw books, it's the same thing, step-by-step, starting with one line and resulting in a complex dinosaur if you're reading an Ed Emberley book. Here's how they were taught to draw penguins. Here are the finished products on the right, and on the left, you start out with those two ovals. And this is actually, there's an X under that because the teacher said that's not the right way to do it, because you can see that the head doesn't go like that. The head fits over the bottom oval in a different way. And this is one of my favorite examples. These are shrimp. And this is what I mean when we were wondering how could Chinese children draw so well. This is by a 6-year-old. And I think you will agree with me that most American 6-year-olds could not do this. Every single 6-year-old in the classroom drew something that looked like this. And the reason was that they started out with one line at a time and built up gradually. Copy, copy, copy. And calligraphy is taught in exactly the same manner. And here is a teacher helping a child, because if the child can't do it right, the teacher simply takes the child's hand and guides the pen. Of course, that would be a real no-no in American schools. Now, back to the 19th century in the United States, I would say this is really a form of mindless education. And it wasn't just art education. Everything was by rote. And here's a comment that was overheard in a 19th century schoolroom and reported by an observer. Don't stop to think, tell me what you know. Don't stop to think, okay? So thinking wasn't encouraged. People didn't talk about teaching thinking or teaching critical thinking or teaching habits of mind. No, they just taught people to memorize. And it's the same in drawing, taught people to copy. And so what you have here is fertile ground for the progressive revolution in the 20th century, the progressive revolt against mindless education. And that was, of course, led by John Dewey, who's pictured here on the left. And he said, give the pupils something to do, not something to learn. And the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking. Learning naturally results. I think that's a wonderful quote. And notice that he's talking about thinking. So the progressive education movement had roots in Europe. There was Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, Pestalozzi in the 19th century in Italy, and Froebel, who was the founder of the kindergarten movement, German, in the 19th century. So it didn't, progressive education didn't grow up originally in the United States. It borrowed from Europe. And I want to talk about the key tenets of progressivism in education, and then talk about the key tenets of progressive art education. First of all, education was to be child-centered, not teacher-centered, the direct opposite of what we saw in the 19th century schoolroom. Children should be free to make discoveries on their own. Don't give them the answers. They have to figure out the answers on their own by discovery. And they will learn best through play and exploration. I'd just like to make a comment about the second one. Let children make discoveries on their own rather than have answers told to them. When we were in China in 1987, we were with our son, who was then 18 months old. And every day when we came down from our room, we had to put a key in a key slot. And the key had a large wooden piece attached to it so that people didn't steal the key. And so to put the key in the key slot, you had to move the key around and so that it fit. Kind of like the post office game, wooden game or plastic game that children have, where they have to fit shapes through a slot. And our son loved to experiment with how to get that key in the key slot. And we would hold him and let him bumble around and try to get it in. And what we found is that a lot of the people in the hotel lobby came over and looked at us very disapprovingly. And some even took our son's hand and turned it so that it would go correctly so that the wooden piece would go into the slot. That's an example of giving the child the answers rather than letting the child discover it on their own. And that's the same culture that was teaching art in the same way as the 19th century Massachusetts schoolroom. Now, here are the key principles, in my opinion, of progressive art education. First of all, the child is seen as an artist. Second, the teacher should have a full knowledge of the natural stages of child art. The teacher is to be seen as a gardener, not an authority figure. I'm going to talk about each one of these in more detail in a second. The teacher should individualize instruction, not have uniform instruction. Visual thinking should be stressed, not copying. And process is more important than product. So let's talk about these. The child as a budding artist. Franz Zizek, again, the founder of the child art movement, said in Hungary, said, there is no art that is so direct as that of children. And here's an example of a work of art by a child that he loved. And he said, look at the strength of these figures. They are as monumental as the Sphinx, as powerful as figures in a bas-relief of ancient Egypt. What rhythm there is in spite of their stiffness. Young child. And he said, when children draw, they make things that might look like errors to the adult, but don't consider them errors. The child's drawing has its own logic, and you can find the same kind of quote unquote errors in pre-Renaissance art and in modern art. Here's one example. Note that the houses are folded out on each side of the road. And note also that the chimneys are at almost right angles from the roof instead of acute angles. I'm sorry, I'm apologizing for typos that I didn't see before. Ignore my typos, please. Here's another example. These are fold outs again, so that you can see on the 7-year-old has drawn the trees folding out on either side of this pond. And on the right, you see a 1400 BC Greek fresco with the same difficulty in the same fold out of the trees. Look at how they fold out on the left-hand side. So don't call this an error. It's another way of representing, Zizek said. No unified point of view. You might consider that an error. But again, he said, no, it's not an error. It's a different strategy. So when I say no unified point of view, I mean the 7-year-old drawing shows the children from the side view, but the chessboard or the checkerboard from the top view. But look at the 14th century painting, exactly the same. Because this is the best way to show the chessboard. If you show it from the side view, you're going to just get a slim line and you're not going to actually get the information that it's a chessboard. So it's a different strategy. It's not trying to be realistic. It's trying to show what's there. Another thing that might be considered an error is showing the invisible. On the left, you have a child's drawing of a woman who's pregnant. And of course, the baby isn't really visible, so it's not realistic. But the child is showing what's there, and you find the exact same thing in the painting by Marc Chagall on the right. Okay, let me say something about the understanding of teacher as a gardener. This is a quote from one of my most favorite mentors, Rudolf Arnheim. In the arts, as well as elsewhere in education, the best teacher is not the one who deals out all he knows or who withholds all he could give, but the one who, with the wisdom of a good gardener, watches, judges, and helps out when needed. Exactly the opposite of what you saw in the 19th century schoolroom, with the teacher telling children exactly what to do. Individualize, okay? The art teacher should not expect all children to draw the same shrimp. Here's a 19th century schoolroom. This is exactly what we don't want. This is completely non-creative. Everybody is drawing something exactly the same way, just like the children in China were drawing the shrimp the same way. The only difference is the shrimp was much more complex and was much more impressive than what you see here. This is another one that comes from Arnheim, and it's one of my favorite. The idea of visual thinking rather than copying. This is an example that he gives of how a child drew a fir tree. And he said what this child has done is created the structural equivalent of the fir tree. He's figured out the basic structure of the tree. And he says creating this kind of structural equivalent is a far more intelligent act than the attempt to mechanically and mindlessly reproduce the tree as would a camera. The child has extracted some of the essence of the structure of the tree, and that's very intelligent. This is what Arnheim said about the 19th century method of drawing teaching. When art educators stress exact copying, they're leaving out the most important aspect of visual images, their expressive power. Children should be helped to think about the dynamic expression embodied in an upright versus a drooping tree, for example, and that capturing the feeling of strength and pride and aggression in the upright tree and the surrender in the drooping tree is an important goal. Process over product. In the 1970 edition of the leading textbook on art education by Victor Lowenfeld, it is stated, it is not the adult's answer, but the child's striving towards his own answer that is crucial. Again, think about the key in the key slot. Think about letting the child reinvent the wheel, because it's the invention part that's important. You can tell the child how to make a wheel, but the child learns a lot more when he tries to invent the wheel. Some people misunderstood, and today still misunderstand, the progressive art movement as a kind of laissez-faire, anything goes. If there are art educators in the room, you will be familiar with the term discipline-based arts education, which was a reaction against progressive education. And in my opinion, the discipline-based arts movement misunderstood progressive arts education, because they thought it was just let the kids do anything they want and the teacher just sits around and does nothing. But that's really not what the good progressive art educators were doing at all. And here's a quote from Victor D'Amico, who was another leading progressive arts educator, who founded the education department at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He said, the art teacher must be an active, positive person. He sets up challenging situations to stimulate the child to think and act on his own. And I think the idea of setting up challenging projects is really important, because the good progressive art educator gives the child a problem to solve, and then lets the child figure out how to do it. The teacher doesn't just say, okay, we're in art class now, and here are the colored pencils, draw. No. Instead, the progressive arts educators gave children what I call constraint enabling prompts. And here are some from Victor Lowenfeld, where he asked kids to draw from these prompts. I'm brushing my teeth. I have a stomach ache. I'm at the circus. What I saw on my way to school. Or draw what you imagine when you listen to this story. I say they're constraint enabling because they're open-ended, so they enable the child, but they have constraints, and the very existence of constraints actually frees the child to do something interesting. Now, I want to talk about how Dewey influenced Europe, because the Reggio Emilia preschools, I think, are a very good example of Deweyan progressive art education. I don't know how many in the audience are familiar with these schools, but they are the most excellent preschools for children that I've ever seen. I think they're the best in the world. And they were founded by Loris Malaguzzi in the 1960s, and he was very influenced by Dewey. And I'm going to give you some examples of what goes on in the Reggio schools. The Reggio preschools do not say they do arts education. They don't use that term, but they actually, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. They say that what they're doing is teaching children to learn, to discover about the world, to use their imagination, to discover different symbol systems. But there's a heavy emphasis on the visual arts. And even though they don't call it art education, I hope I can convince you that what's going on there is art education, and it's very much like progressive art education in the United States that in the first half of this century. So what I think is the Reggio Emilia schools shake up our assumptions of what preschoolers are capable of. This is a mural that was done collaboratively, and collaborative is a key term, I'll come back to this, by 5 to 6 year olds. And I can't make it bigger because then it loses its, it gets fuzzy, but I want to show you some of the details. Look at that child drawn, that person, I think it's a child, and the profile. Look at the watermelon. Look at the fish. And here's another profile, a person running. Those are pretty sophisticated drawings for 5 to 6-year-olds. And I can assure you they were not done by teaching children in the step-by-step manner that you saw in China. So I'm going to try to unpack how these were done. I'll just show you a couple more examples. There's also a focus on drawing from observation. And you can see this going on here. And I've just pulled out a detail of the Reggio mural on the left and contrasted it with a spontaneous drawing by a preschool child in the United States. This was not done with any kind of art education method. It was just something the child did on her own. And I think this is it's very charming, and it's typical, maybe 6-year-old, 5 or 6-year-old art. But the difference between the two is palpable, because the one on the right is very schematic, and the one on the left is very differentiated and shows high observational skills and is much more complex. So how is it possible that the Italian 6-year-old can draw like on the left, whoops, and which is so much, dare I use the word better, more sophisticated, more inventive than the child on the right? So there are 6 key principles that I've observed in the Reggio schools. I've had the great fortune of being able to visit these schools several times. And each time I visit, I can hardly believe what I'm seeing. It's so impressive. One principle has to do with the environment. I'm going to talk about each one of these, but let me just lay them out for you. The environment, the physical environment that the children see, the kinds of projects they're given, which are constraint enabling projects, the fact that everything is done collaboratively. The kids work together on the same drawings. The fact that art is seen as a form of research and discovery. The very active role of the teacher, not laissez-faire at all, but not top down. And the importance given to documenting the student work. Okay, so first of all, the environment. When you walk into one of these preschools in northern Italy, you are struck by the orderliness of the environment. These are just things that I happen to notice, and you can see how beautifully everything is laid out and color-coded, really. You've got the blues on the left, the greens on the right, and on the bottom, everything is white. All the materials are laid out each day for the child so that when they enter the classrooms, everything looks just a feast for the eyes. The kinds of projects. Well, first of all, kids are given complicated and long-term projects that take weeks or even months. The projects are guided by what's called an atelierista, who is really an artist, as well as by the classroom teacher. The atelierista is always there, sitting with the children, as is the classroom teacher. The kids work together, and there's a lot of focus on observation, but they're never asked to copy pictures. They do draw from observation. So here's an example of drawing from observation. I already showed you the middle one. The one on the left are very young children. I think these are 2 or 3-year-olds drawing leaves. And the one on the right, children are working on a light box, and they are drawing the ferns they see above them. And you can see how they're working together on the same painting. And one is working on one side and one is working on the other, so some things may look upside down. Okay, what do I mean by art as research? Well, children are always, they're given problems that they have to solve. So I'm going to show you soon that children are trying to figure out how to show a head in clay from the back, or how to make a clay chair stand up so that it doesn't fall down. They're discussing with each other and experimenting and looking at each other's solutions, all with the active guidance of the teacher and the atelierista. And finally, before I show you some images, there is this huge emphasis on documentation. They don't just send the kids' artwork home with the kids every day to go on the refrigerator. The drawings are kept and they're put into books and they're put in exhibitions, and they are stored so that they are preserved beautifully. And this allows, this documentation allows the teachers and the parents and the children to look at growth and to be able to reflect on growth. And the teachers talk to the students a lot about how they've grown. So the message really is what children make and what they say about it matters. So I want to show you now how kids are able to produce a very complicated image. Children, 5 and 6-year-olds, were asked to create this scene of their classroom assembly. All the kids sit around in a circle, and the teacher said, how do you think we could draw this scene so that kids in another school could see what our classroom assembly looks like? So it's a complicated task to ask kids to draw about 20 kids sitting around in a circle. So how did they go about it? And by the way, after they finished figuring out how to do the drawing, they were asked, now, can you see if you can do the same thing in clay? And they produced this. 5 and 6-year-olds. How did they do it? Okay, so the challenge again was, what if we had to describe the assembly to children in another city who never had one? That's what the teacher said. And you can see the line, the white line on the right is pointing to the teacher. And these are all the little 5 and 6-year-old Italian children in this class. So the first thing they did is they started taking photographs. The kids were all given cameras. They took pictures of each other sitting. They took pictures of the bench on which some of them were sitting so that they could figure out how to draw the bench. And after they took as many pictures as they wanted and talked about the pictures, they made some drawings. And these were some of their initial drawings, just drafts. And after they made some drafts, they were projected with an overhead projector onto a big sheet, and they had a class critique. So these are 5 and 6-year-olds. They're looking at each other's drawings, and they're figuring out what they did right, what they did wrong. So here's one child saying, oh, so you draw the legs like this because they're bent. In other words, he was trying to figure out how to draw bent legs. He hadn't quite figured it out. And here, looking at somebody else's, he figured it out. So they're all working together, and they're not just saying, oh, that's good, I like that. No, they're actually looking at what kids did and trying to figure out what works and what didn't work. When they made the final drawing, and this was after many weeks of discussing, looking at each other's drafts, photographing, trying things out, trying again, here's a child saying, now I want to draw the hardest thing, 2 children from behind, but with their faces in profile. So now this child is actually setting herself a challenge, a really complicated challenge. And in the end, they produced this group drawing where each kid had drawn one part of it. Then they were asked to do the same thing in clay. And this brings up all kinds of new challenges. So they started out in the same way. They didn't have to make photographs again because they'd already made them, but they had to figure out how to work this in clay, how to make a person sit up and not fall down, how to make a head stick on and not fall off, how to bend the legs and not have them break. Here's an example of a child who said to another child, maybe you made the body too little and that's why it won't stand up. She couldn't get it to stand up. So you see, the one child is helping the other child figure out the problem in clay. They talk, they discuss, they critique, and they try again. So on the top, you have one child saying, when I saw David's chair, I thought the seat here underneath was too thin. And then David on the bottom said, and I thought of putting some more legs to support the back because otherwise it would fall over. So they're helping each other, they're collaborating, and they're solving a visual problem. This is David's chair and David's child. And this is the final group sculpture. It's very complicated. And if you had just entered into a classroom without any background and just tell 5 and 6-year-olds, I want you to make a clay sculpture of all the kids sitting around in a circle, kids would not know what to do. But the teacher starts them out by saying, take some photographs, look at how kids look when they're sitting, try it out, work together with somebody else. Actually, the kids were divided up into the chair group and the person group. So half of the class had to work on the chairs and half on the people. And all the kids are working together. No kid is alone. So what I think you see is that the Reggio children are overcoming simple schemas. I think the one on the right is pretty simple and schematic. They're overcoming those schemas by observing and discussing and disputing and working together and spending a long time. The drawing on the right was probably made quickly in one shot. The drawing on the left, the painting on the left, is part of a long-term project that actually took months to do. So it's a very different enterprise. And what I'd like to have my takeaway message be is that if you have the kind of art education that challenges students to think hard about visual problems, and if you let the kids solve them together, and you don't give them the answers, but you guide them and say, well, maybe you could try it this way, maybe you could try it that, let's look over here at what somebody else has done, then it may be that the literal stage dip that I talked about, maybe that's not inevitable and certainly need not be lasting. So that is my takeaway. And I actually have one more thing I want to talk about, because I was asked explicitly to talk about the issue of art making during the pandemic. And I wanted to talk about the question of whether art making can improve children's well-being. And here I'm going to focus on the research of my former student, Jen Drake, who's a professor at Brooklyn College. And she's done a number of studies that show that the very simple act of drawing, and this is just a one-shot quick drawing, it's not the Reggio Emilia kind of long-term collaborative project, but just making a simple drawing on your own actually has positive mood effects. And here's what she does. She asks kids to think about something very sad, something that made them feel very sad or something that disappointed them very much. And she measures their mood before she gives them this prompt and after. And it's a self-report mood scale that young children know how to fill out. And what she finds is that her mood induction is successful. Kids report feeling much sadder after they think about something very sad. And then she divides them up randomly into 2 groups. And one group is told, draw about what you're sad about. And the other group is told to draw something entirely different. They're usually given something to draw, like draw a picture of your sneaker, for example. And so she calls the first group the express group and the second group the distract group. Now, I just like to ask you to think to yourself, what would be most helpful for a child who is feeling very sad? To draw something, to draw about what they were sad about and kind of work it out on the paper, or to draw something that has nothing to do with what they're sad about? If you take an art therapy kind of approach, you would think that drawing something that you're sad about would help you kind of flush it out of your system, work it out. And actually, that's what we expected to find. But over and over, what Jen has found is that when children distract themselves by drawing, their mood improves the most. Both methods improve the child's mood. But when the child distracts his or herself by drawing something completely different, their mood improves significantly more than in the express condition. We sometimes call it the venting condition. So you can use the word distract which sounds kind of superficial, but you can also think about it as escape into an imaginary world, which is what many artists feel that they're doing, that art is the way they can get away from the struggles and the pain of daily life into an invented world. And I think this is very useful to think about, because I know that children are very often very sad today because they can't see their friends. I have a 5-year-old granddaughter who has to have kindergarten on Zoom, and she can't see anybody but her parents. And that does not make her happy, and it makes me even more unhappy. But having kids draw is a way of helping them to improve their mood, and having them draw something that takes them away from what they're upset about seems to be the best method. So it's actually 8 o'clock, and we ended on the early side. It is time now for me to thank you for your attention, and now we have more time for questions. So I'm open for questions.
Great. Ellen, thank you for taking folks through that. And we've been getting a number of questions as you've been going along. So I'll just jump right in and read a few of the questions and
Okay.
get started. So the first question was, how do you teach a child art without stifling creativity? And the related question, can you talk about how you define creativity and what do you consider to be creative skills related to children's artistic development?
Ooh, all right. All right. I think the first one is a little easier for me to answer. How do you teach art without stifling creativity? I think that implies that if you do any kind of teaching at all, telling a child what to do or giving a child a suggestion, that you are stifling their creativity. And I would argue just the reverse. I think if you give children absolutely no guidance at all, or no ideas, or no problem to confront, children are going to fall back on stereotypes. So that's why I use the term constraint enabling problems, open-ended problems. You don't give them the solution, but you challenge them, and then they figure out a solution on their own. So I don't think that, I think if you teach children in a step-by-step way, that does stifle creativity. How do I define creativity? I mean, drawing something in your own way, in art, doing something that's not rule governed, that is your own invention, that is playful, that is exploratory, where you're not bound by some kind of pre-noticed schema. You're on your own, you're being inventive. It's just a very simple definition. In terms of the skills needed for creativity, well, of course, to be a creative artist, you need technical skills. So young children don't have those technical skills. Adult artists do. They've passed through this literal stage where they've probably developed a lot of technical skills. And certainly that's important so that you can really control what you want to do in your visual art. In our work, which we call studio thinking, we have documented a number of habits of mind that artists use and that we think are taught in very good arts classes, which really do help the child to make art that is creative. Learning to look closely, learning to reflect on your work and evaluate your own work, learning to stretch and explore. That certainly comes very close to creativity. Learning to stick to things and over time and not just give up in 3 minutes or 1 minute. These are various kinds of habits of mind that I think help children's work become more creative with development.
Yeah, that's helpful. Habits of the mind would be something for us to explore more about. Another question, I think goes to this sense that a lot of kids sort of understand or sort of tend to think that there's a right and a wrong. And so how do we help kids understand that their creative perspectives are not incorrect when they say they see it as bad or wrong compared to other students who might draw something more realistic, if you will?
Yeah.
It's like they can't be convinced. Any Any advice to help convince kids that they're not wrong? It's not
Yeah,
incorrect.
and I think that the questioner is probably asking about kids who are older than preschool kids, because I don't think preschool kids do that so much, but older kids are likely to say, oh, this isn't any good, I can't draw. And they become very self-critical. And that's what Chizek was saying too. The child becomes very self-critical and it stifles creativity. I think one method is to show children artwork by adult artists, which have some of the same kind of quote unquote errors in them. They're not realistic, or they have this lack of unified point of view that I showed you, or they have foldouts, and say, there's many ways to draw. Realism is only one way. And look at, or you could show children all the different ways that people have done portraits, from realistic to cubist to impressionist to sketchy, just to show them that there's more than one way to make art. And it's not, there's no right and wrong answer.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good suggestion to show the examples of, multiple different ways that people have drawn the same thing.
Yeah.
And they're all right in their own way. But that's a very good suggestion. Another question, goes back to the discussion of the art by Paul Klee. Is there a possibility, this is their question, right? Is there a possibility that our positive judgments about preschoolers' art have to do with our moment in history or art history? Would a judge in the year 1600 have judged, Klee's 5-year-old art or his 12-year-old art as superior? We can't unsee or unlearn our association of art, such as Klee's, as fresh and creative, and the art of earlier realists as stilted and old. I don't think your points are wrong. I'm just wondering about this factor of, the moment in history.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I did say that this is something that's specific to the Western modernist aesthetic. David Pariser, an art educator in Canada, took this finding and said, I wonder whether we're going to find a U-shaped curve in, if we ask the judges to judge child art and have the judges be from China. And he had Chinese American judges, and they were not steeped in the Western aesthetic. They were steeped much more in a traditional aesthetic, and they actually did not judge. They looked at Jessica Davis's children's art. She's the one who documented the U curve, and they actually documented a straight curve going up. They just saw that realism, getting more and more realistic, was what counted, and therefore they saw no specialness in the art of the young child. And I think that if you asked a 16th century artist or non-artist to look at the work of Klee as a child, as an 11-year-old or 12-year-old, and as an adult, they would probably value the 12-year-old artist the best. So we are extremely influenced by what our culture values in art.
Yeah. Here's a question that I think is particularly relevant given all the home kids learning at home that's going on today. It's a question about parents. How can a parent support art development at home where there are not other kids to bounce ideas off of? Thinking about the Reggio example, especially when the parent isn't very artistic. We could argue with that right off. So isn't able to take on the role of that art teacher person at the Italian schools, the Reggio teacher.
Wow, well, that's hard. Because first of all, I don't know how much kids bat ideas off of each other in preschools. They think they're often work pretty much on their own, unless they're in the Reggio school where they have to work together. So it may be okay that the child doesn't have other kids around, but I think that there are books the parent can get about how to do art with your child. There are some wonderful books, and they have projects in them. There was one by Muriel, I'm forgetting her name, from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Doing Art with Your Child. I would look for books like that to give you examples of projects that you can engage in with your child. And it doesn't only have to be making paintings, it can be building things, um, making things out of wood. And the parent doesn't have to be particularly artistic either. The parent can play along with the child and make things out of wood too, and do the projects with the child.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of the answer is to go back to the question too that asked about, things being incorrect or bad or wrong. Maybe the right answer to this question is, parents simply by trying and working on it and showing interest and being supportive,
Exactly.
you
If the
know.
parent does it with the child, I think that's very motivating for the child. I know that when my two granddaughters come to visit, they differ in different families and they come to visit at different times, and each one wants to paint and they want me to paint too. So I sit next to them and we do watercolors together. And I think that if I just said, you want a watercolor, they probably wouldn't do it. But doing it with me makes them want to do it. So parents should do it with the child. It's not really going to free you up, give you free time. It's something you got to do with the child.
I think I would probably be great at it because I'm sure that my art skills have not progressed past about 5 years old. So I'd be really perfect at it.
Well, if you're at 5 years, you're in the great flowering stage, so you should be very happy.
There you go.
Most of us are in the literal stage.
Yeah, I don't think I ever made it to literal. So here's a question. My daughter has severe anxiety and is extremely artistic. Do you think that the two are connected? Art seems to be an outlet for her. This is sort of.
I don't think there's any evidence that anxiety and artistic ability go together, though there is some evidence that kids at adolescence who are very involved in the arts also have more depressive symptoms. And I'm not sure why that is, but we also do know that artists, if you compare artists to non-artists, and this differs by the art form, you do find higher rates of mental illness in various kinds of artists than in the population at large. It's still the minority though. I think the worst rates of mental illness are for female poets. But I would not assume that there's any necessary relationship in your child's anxiety and artistic ability. But I do think that if art is an outlet, that's wonderful. And I would be interested to know whether your child is using art to express and vent what she's upset and concerned about, or whether it's to escape and distract herself into a new world.
It's an interesting question. Here's a particularly relevant question for these times. So I'm interested in non-white cultural examples of art education. I teach in a school that has a majority of students of color. What cultural examples could I use to spark their interest? Are there artists of color or educators of color that you would recommend researching?
Well, there's a big push in 20th century art education towards social justice art, and also to looking at contemporary art. And there is a wonderful public video series called Art 21, and it features contemporary artists, and many of them are of color. And I think and there are many art teachers, including at the elementary level, are trying to incorporate contemporary art into their classroom. And I think it would be very useful to look at some of those videos and show them to your children.
That's good advice. Have there been studies which show how students from Reggio Emilia preschools developed as artists as they go through adolescence and adulthood?
Yeah,
do Reggio kids grow up to be better than the rest of us, I guess?
So that's the $1 million question. And there actually was a huge study done comparing the Reggio children to the children in surrounding areas by an economist, and he found no difference. However, the people at Reggio felt that the measures he used didn't really have much to do with the kinds of things the kids were learning in Reggio. He looked at things like, did the kids grow up to have a job and get married and be successful? And in these kinds of broad demographic areas, there was no difference. But what he didn't look at were things like, did they walk down the street and notice the environment, notice the beauty in the environment more? Are they more likely to be drawn to the arts? There's so many things that were not looked at that could have been looked at. So the answer is, we don't know. My guess is it's not the case that these kids are going to grow up to be artists, but they may grow up to be more playful, more open-minded, and also always have the arts in their minds so that they can return and be appreciators of the arts. But we don't know the answer to that question. It's tempting to say they're going to be completely different from everybody else, but we don't know. I just don't think that the big study that was done had the right measures in it for us to say, okay, it's not, there's no difference. And you know what, even if it turned out there was no difference, if you see what's going on in these classrooms, you can see that it's just so intrinsically wonderful and joyful that you wouldn't say, okay, let's just trash it because these kids don't grow up any different. You would say, let's still do it because it's fantastically, intrinsically worthwhile.
Is there any connection between having a really wonderful art education as a young child and particular professions or careers that people go into? Is there been any correlation between, are all great scientists also great artists? Or
no, there is a researcher named Robert Root Bernstein who's looked at this a lot, and he claims that the greatest scientists had a lot of art in their background, and had and dabbled in the arts. And so there's some evidence that great scientists are very broad in their interests and have interest in the arts.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who talk about the sort of the habits of the mind that you mentioned, are also similar lists for being great scientists.
Right, but I should add that I think that it is not the case that great scientists tend to be great artists. I just said that the greatest scientists have interests in the arts,
Yeah,
more than the less great scientists, according to Root Bernstein's work. Most people are not extremely great and eminent in more than one area. It's very hard to be a great artist and a great chemist. And most people don't have the proclivity for both or the time for both.
right. Except that guy we celebrate at the Discovery Museum, Da Vinci, right? There was somebody who's the exception to that rule, right?
Definitely the exception. Yes.
That's great. Here's a question from an arts educator. Says, as this person says, as an art educator, I find the biggest struggle is re-educating parents about the field of art education. I spend a lot of time talking about adult versus child aesthetics and about the studio habits of mind. It feels like these gains are slipping away during the pandemic with distance learning because the child's parent is a big influence on the child's education. Do you have any suggestions on how to nurture creativity while instructing from a distance?
Well, there's several questions in there. First of all, I would say re-educating parents, yes, a big problem, because parents and adults in general seem to think that one of the reasons that basically the only reason art education is good is because it improves kids' test scores and makes them smarter. And my colleague Lois Hetland and I did a lot of research on this quite a while ago and published a series of meta-analyses showing that all of the studies that claimed that arts education improved grades and test scores and other things like math and reading did not hold up. That is a false claim. There's a lot of correlational evidence, but there's no causal evidence. In other words, kids that take a lot of arts tend to be good students, but taking a lot of arts doesn't make you a good student. So that's one thing that parents need to be re-educated about. They need to understand that art education is important for its own sake, because if you only educate kids in the basic literacies and in math and science, you're only giving them half an education. And if you think of the greatest things that humans have accomplished, it's not only science, but it's also the arts. So parents need to understand the importance of the arts, and it's not enough for the child just to prep from day one for his college math and reading SATs. So that's one thing. In terms of nurturing creativity from a distance, I think that comes back to the question where I talked about getting some good books about doing art with your child at home and doing interesting projects with your art, with your child. Because, oh, actually, I think this was a question from an art teacher about how to teach art on Zoom. Is
Yeah.
that correct, Neil?
Yeah, it's about how to
Ah,
foster that creativity, even though you're not there.
that is just so difficult. It seems to me that the best thing is to get the parent involved so that you can get the parent involved to do projects with the child. So you teach both the parent and the child. I don't know if the art teacher wants to comment, who asked the question wants to comment on that, but it seemed to me an interesting idea to get the parent to listen to what the child's being asked to do so the parent can then do the project with the child or alongside the child.
Yeah. I mean, every teacher in every subject, I think, is probably struggling with, the barrier that they're facing in teaching through distance.
Absolutely. But, if you're teaching kids to do math, simple arithmetic, and you can give them a worksheet and they can go through it maybe on their own. But if you really want to get them to think creatively in something, that's where I think you need to have, especially if it's a young child, you need to have a parent involved. If it's an older child, if it's a high schooler, it's a lot easier, I would think, though it's still very, very hard.
All right. Here's a question about some of the skills you mentioned. You spoke about observing, discussing, disputing, and working together, and how that can help children overcome the dip in the curve or overly rigid expression of schema. What are creativity killers? Are they the opposite of the list I just read, or is there more than that?
I think the creativity killers are the kinds of things I talked about in the beginning. Telling children the right answers, telling children how to draw something, teaching children there's only one way to draw it so that every child's drawing comes out the same. Getting kids to copy, there's nothing wrong with observation, but getting them to copy your drawing because your drawing is the right way. And I don't actually have anything against children copying art by artists, but I do have something against teachers saying, this is how you draw a tree, copy mine. There was something I was going to say about that just went out of my head. Well, I can't remember what I was going to say, but I think teaching children step by step and getting them to copy your drawing and giving them the answers and making them think that there's a way that's right and the way that's wrong is definitely a way to kill creativity. I wouldn't say those are the opposite of our habits of mind, but they have nothing to do with our habits of mind.
Yeah, that's good. Maybe just a couple of quick more questions, Ellen, and then we'll wrap up because you've been very generous with your time. Where does a parent go to find a good art class? How can a parent evaluate whether an art class is good in terms of developing skills for supporting creativity?
Are you talking about how can a parent find a good art class for their child?
Yeah. And how do they evaluate that it's good in terms of the kinds of skills you've talked about?
Right. By the way, do you know there's a wonderful art school in Acton? What we used to do research in? What is it called? Acton Art? Does that sound familiar to you?
It doesn't ring any bells with me, but my kids didn't grow up in Acton, so
Okay.
I don't remember.
Okay. I think often museums have very good art programs, Saturday programs, and community centers. So probably a parent isn't going to be able to pick and choose the art class in her child's school. But if you look at art outside of school, and you look at whether kids are being allowed to work together on large projects, whether they're given interesting, challenging projects to work on, whether they have critique sessions so that they can learn from each other. Those are the things I would look for. And also look at whether the kids look engaged.
Right. By the way, our audience is a lot more knowledgeable about this apparently than I am. Everybody is giving a shout out to Acton Art.
Okay.
It's on Route 2 in Acton, and everybody gives it a very positive.
Yeah. Now they have a very different method of teaching. They actually teach kids to draw very realistically. But in a very complicated way. And the things the kids are able to produce are really astounding. And they're not doing it in any step-by-step way.
Right. I was struck listening to you describe the process around good art education, and just so much of that. I was listening to and thinking, well, you could take the word art out of every sentence you said, and what you're describing is good teaching and good education.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that progressive education, when it's in other subjects, looks like progressive art education. It's the same basic principles.
It's always nice to see Dewey's name come up in the progressive movement, because that's of course the era in which children's museums were created, and
Exactly.
it was out of that same period that our whole field emerged. So
Yeah, and children's museums are a wonderful example of how to nurture creativity, because children, it's all about exploring and discovering. And there's no right and wrong answers. There's no tests. You can't fail.
right, and learning to problem solve and work together, and I mean all of the great
Right.
things you described. Look at things, reflect about them, think on them.
Right.
It was terrific. Alan, this was really fascinating tonight, and by the record number of people who signed up for tonight and the extraordinary number of questions, this is really an important topic for lots of folks out there, both the educators in the audience and the parents in the audience. And I think you've given everybody a lot to chew on. So I really want to thank you for taking the time to do this tonight. And
Okay, great. And if people had questions that they really want to talk to me about, they can always email me at winner@bc.edu.
that's great. Look out, your email is going to be full now when you turn around.
That's okay.
That's great. Well, thank you to everyone out there for joining us tonight, and check out the program that you would have gotten via email for more information about Ellen and about the speaker series and our upcoming next event. So for everybody's, have a good evening. Take care.